Welcome to MDS, and thanks for being here. So, we happen to have all kinds of boards and scraps here, in all kinds of shapes and sizes. And since I just didn't want to cut them all down and throw them into the fire pit, I decided to build a jig for gluing up panels, with stuff I had laying around, like pipe clamps, T-profile steel, more T-profile steel, and maybe some rectangular steel pipes. Well, you should be able to construct something with this, right? I've had this idea floating around in my head for quite some time now, going back and forth, imagining how this jig could come together, but since it just refused to build itself, well... I started off by ripping a 4x6. That's centimeters, since Germany's not officially part of the empire. Yet. Anyway, in imperial that would measure around 1 2/3 by 2 7/16. Yeah. So, with these two pieces planed and clamped together, I cut grooves every 4 inches, so the T-profiles would fit right into them. For a glue up, the boards will sit right on top of the T-profiles, which should make it easier to control the mess. And of course this makes for proper airflow underneath. Next up were the holes for the pipe clamps to sit in. First, test fit. At this point I hadn't yet quite figured out how to fix coils on top, but hey, first things first. All in all, this was a good starting point.
So hätte ich mir das vorgestellt.
So I grabbed some scraps and ripped them down on the table saw for the first glue up. And doing a dry fit, I realized a few things that needed to be addressed. The boards had a slight twist, so to get them as straight as possible, I put T-profiles as coils on top, and they did what they were supposed to do. But the way to keep them in place and apply pressure was kind of awkward, and slightly annoying, and pretty inefficient, so to say. Also, since the pipe clamps weren't fixed yet, they kept rolling to the side, meaning I had to use both hands on each clamp, holding it with one hand while turning the handle to fasten it, until it sat firmly enough so it wouldn't roll anymore. Well, nix gut. But for the sake of testing, I went ahead and glued up the panel anyway, which happened to work much better than I expected. Still, I also realized that the way the coils were clamped on the far side, well, let's put it this way, I figured there should be some kind of fixed mechanism that would allow me to put the necessary downward pressure on that end of the coils. Taking the first panel out of the clamps was actually quite satisfying. I happened to like the way the panel came out, and that first test also showed me what kind of issues would have to be taken care of. Moving on, I had this box which I had slapped together a couple of years ago, and it was crappy. So I dismantled it, bore out a few broken screws, and ripped down the boards on the table saw. The glue-up was fine, and now came the time for improvements. First of all, the pipe clamps got cut to length, and as to the coils, I had decided to fix in some bolts from underneath, which would allow me to fasten the coils from the top. One down, 4 to go. Overall, this seemed like a good solution, and to hold the clamps in place, I glued a few scraps in, which works fine. And these small blocks would give the clamps on the coils on the front of the jig a place to properly sit on. Also, I gave the T-profiles a good layer of wax, so the panels wouldn't stick to them once the glue had set in. Round 3. More scraps cut to size on the table saw. The improvements worked out really well as to the handling. Gluing up the boards was easy, and taking the panel out once the glue had settled was once again very satisfying. Then came the time to work the panel surfaces. And since I don't have a planer, I did it by hand, with a little help from my friends, the belt sander and the orbital sander. So by then I had 3 panels. Of course, I don't consider these panels to be pretty, but they are made from scraps, and around here there's indeed use for something like this. And since this setup worked quite okay, I don't expect to have any issues turning jointed and planed slats into pretty panels if needed. Was it worth it? Well, I get to use the panels instead of burning the scraps, and I'm fine with that. Besides, one should always be able to properly glue up boards into a panel, right? Still, there was an issue. The T-profiles did bend, quite unexpectedly, a lot more than I had anticipated. Even putting wooden cowls with a slight chamfer towards both ends underneath the steel didn't fix that problem. So eventually I decided to drop the idea of using steel cowls altogether and cut wooden slats, chamfered them quite extensively, and fixed them to the bolts on the jig as cowls, which actually did the trick. I guess sometimes things don't need to be overcomplicated. The 4th panel also came out pretty nicely, and by that time I was quite satisfied with the way this whole glue-up jig thing came together, and with the minimal costs I had. And in case you're wondering what happened to those panels, well, how about subscribing to our channel and joining us on our journey, for this has only just begun. Cheers folks, until next time, be well, see ya.